Welcome to this keynote address at the Tax Justice Network annual conference on human rights and the 4 R's of tax justice. Translation is available in Spanish and English at the left bottom of the conference platform. I am incredibly honored to introduce our keynote speaker, Andres Arauz. He is an Ecuadorian economist, a tax and social justice campaigner, and a candidate for the presidency of Ecuador in the 2021 elections. No introduction does justice to Mr. Arauz's impressive achievements, so I will only highlight a few. As said, Mr. Arauz was a runner-up in the Ecuadorian 2021 presidential elections, where he ran on a progressive, intercultural, economic sovereignty, tax justice, innovation, and education-led and equal rights platform. He is also a founding council member of Progressive International, is currently completing his PhD in financial economics at the UNAM at Mexico City. He's a former Minister of Knowledge and Human Talent of Ecuador and the former Chief Operating Officer of the Central Bank of Ecuador. He has also sat on the boards of the Ecuadorian Tax Committee, Foreign Trade Committee, and the Public Debt Committee, and has been a vocal supporter of Latin American regional financial and productive integration. He has further worked with civil society organizations from around the world on tax justice, illicit financial flows, and monetary reform, and has done consulting work in these areas. He has also transformed Ecuador's national payment system in favor of technological and economic inclusion of the popular and solidarity financial sector. You can also join the live discussion button in the right bottom chat, where you can ask us some questions that we will try and take a few towards the end of the session. But for now, it's an incredible honor and pleasure to introduce Mr. Arauz, who will directly speak to us. The floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Roos. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you everybody who is here. Thank you for the invitation. It is truly an honor. I very much appreciate this opportunity to talk to all of you. I have been a participant in previous TJN conferences in Peru and London, and I really wish we could be meeting in person. Thanks again to everyone, Tax Justice Network, co-organizers, and all of the allies. I have prepared a few slides to share with you. If you allow me, I will proceed with that. And I'd like to share a few slides. There we go. Okay, I guess everybody can see that now. So I'd like to talk to you about the human rights, tax justice, and campaign finance. You know, these issues, I find them to be related, especially according to my recent experience. First, mention to you that in the recent elections, I ran against a tax evading offshore banker. Mr. Lasso controls over $4 billion in assets and hides his $140 million net worth under a network of trusts, offshore vehicles, and close relatives. He doesn't even own the house he lives in. His offshore bank was a topic of my academic research. So that made the encounter in the politics arena very interesting. But first, I'd like to talk about human rights, especially the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and the San Salvador Protocol of the American Convention of Human Rights, especially with regards to how we can link human rights, tax justice, revenue, illicit financial flows, and something that's very useful for undertaking this challenge is the Kathmandu Declaration, the Civil Society Declaration on Human Rights and Tax Justice that was issued a few years ago, where not only narrow tax issues are faced, but also capital flight, misinvoicing, profit shifting, opacity in general, illegitimate debt, which is very important for the South, investor-state arbitral awards that are crucial for the current 21st century developments in the international sphere, tax abuse, money laundering, bribes, and so on. So this is, in general, the framework where I would like to talk about today. So here's the International Covenant's Article 2, Section 1, where it talks about how each state must take steps to through individually or through international cooperation, especially economic and technical, to the maximum of its available resources, with a view of achieving progressively the full realization of human rights in this government. This is very important. This is the legal link between human rights and tax justice. As I will mention later, this does not only have to do with tax, because resources have to be understood more broadly, but within the monetary sphere, there are also other issues such as debt and illegal and illicit flows. However, the most important major economy and most powerful country nowadays has not ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. I'm talking about the United States. So this is very important because we will see some contradictions as to how the international system and human rights try to be linked with other economic issues, and how the fact that the United States is not part of it is an important element. Now, in the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas, we have the American Convention of Human Rights. And in Article 1 of the Protocol of San Salvador, which has to do with economic and social rights, it also mentions the maximum available resources doctrine. So this is important, that something that exists at the UN or international level also exists at the Western Hemisphere. However, both Canada and the United States have not ratified the American Convention on Human Rights. This is basically a Latin American issue as well. Even though the seat, the headquarters of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights is in Washington, D.C., the US has never ratified this agreement. Again, this is important to understand the link between human rights issues and economic issues as well. Now, when we say maximum available resources, we cannot only think about maximizing revenue. It is also about tax justice in general, but also about debt justice, where countries in the periphery of the South are facing inequalities and asymmetries, but also investor-state dispute settlement justice, where all of a sudden we have this increase in arbitrations against developing countries that have to be resolved in the North, especially in the World Bank's ICSID. The thing is, most of these arbitrations have to do with either tax policy, royalty policy, maximization of revenue for a government's policy, and in other times also with environmental and labor policies that countries of the South take. So this becomes a very important issue as well. Now, I also think that maximum available resources should not only entail an obligation for states, but also for non-state actors. Sure, the conventions are pretty clear that they refer to states, but because the tax, debt, and ISDS issues have to do with non-state counterparts, non-state actors become an essential part of what we call tax justice. This is a paper that was recently published by our friends in the Latin American Human Rights and Tax Justice organizations. You can see them below. And it has to do with non-state actors and standards for tax policy and human rights. As you can see, I was the author of this piece, and this is an introduction basically to who I am, right? I try to summarize most of what I've researched, most of what I've studied, both in terms of theory, in terms of international law, but also in terms of practice, having the practical experience of having been in government. And that was basically who was running against a banker. Here you can see a picture from the political campaign when I was running and meeting with young people all over the place. Now, the contents of the paper basically have to do with illicit financial flows and human rights standards. The first section has to do with human rights standards that I will show you in a minute. The second one has to do with standards for non-state enablers, where we mention many of the gatekeepers of the current system, the OECD, the FATF, the US FATCA, and many others that are mostly binding for non-state enablers in terms of reporting information and some behavioral aspects as well. And then finally, self-regulatory or voluntary standards for non-state enablers, where we have the IFRS, the International Public Standards for accounting, for public sectors, and accountants, lawyers, banks, and so on, right? Now, here you have the link if you want to download the paper. Unfortunately, it's only available in Spanish. Hopefully, it can be translated by one of you or whoever is interested in that. We can also update some of the issues there. But here you have all of the human rights standards that I found were related somehow to illicit financial flows and policy that must be derived from that. Here, I'd like to, there are many of them. Many are UN related, others come from civil society and so on. But I would like to highlight a couple of them. One has to do with the global Magnitsky international sanctions, human rights sanctions regulations. And it's very important because, as you remember, the United States has not ratified the Covenant for Economic and Social Rights. However, there is in place a system that allows for the US, through the international financial system, to sanction individuals for violations of serious human rights abuses, okay? Now, this shows you, besides the fact that these are unilateral sanctions, and I'm against those, I'm in favor of multilateral ones, but this shows the fact that the international financial system can be leveraged for the compliance of human rights, right? It can be leveraged. The technical instruments are there. What we need is political will. And the Magnitsky Global Human Rights Act is what is a clear demonstration of that. Now, also important, and as a footnote, perhaps, is that Magnitsky, the person who was assassinated in Russia, whose human rights were violated, was actually an accountant who was accused of tax evasion. How's that for a paradox? Anyway, the ISDS issues that have to do with investor-state arbitration are also very important because, like I mentioned, many of them have to do with tax justice or revenue-raising issues, but also with demanding compliance of human rights of transnational corporations. Now we have privatized tribunals that are affecting human rights and tax justice simultaneously. This is why we need a new human rights standard that we have to push for, which is the binding agreement of transnational corporations of human rights, right? A binding agreement of human rights for transnational corporations that has been discussed at the UN, at the Human Rights Commission for over a decade without concrete results. Ecuador was one of the first and leading proponents of it. This is a document I really like. It was issued by the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. It's called Business and Human Rights Inter-American Standards. I recommend it to everybody. There's both a Spanish and English version, but I won't be able to get into the details here, but there are many interesting issues there, including, of course, compliance with tax justice issues for corporations. Now, coming back to the campaign. Illicit financial flows were a big deal in Ecuador and were a big deal in the campaign. They took center stage. Please recall that I had been blogging in my Observatorio de la Dolarización, or now the English version called Dollarization Watch, and I had been giving interviews. I had been basically campaigning for regulation of regulation of illicit financial flows. And of course, as I was coming into the campaign, this was one of the major issues that I brought onto the political discussion in Ecuador. As you can see there, the news piece says that I was planning on repatriating or bringing back about $30 billion worth of Ecuadorian capital flight that had been deposited abroad. Now, who was I running against? Like I mentioned, this is my opponent, who had been featured in the Paradise Papers and who was a protagonist of capital flight. He owned several banks, one of them in Panama, an offshore center, whose main line of business was to promote capital flights and tax evasion from Ecuador to Panama and there onwards. It's very interesting that this got basically no media coverage, even though he was part, and he was part of the Offshore Leaks database, part of the Paradise Papers. And not even his most intimate property is in his name. And in Ecuador, we had a law that forbid people who had offshore holdings from becoming candidates. However, just 1 month before the election, before the election registration, so the moment you have to register as candidates, he put all of his property in the name of his sons. Interestingly, not of his daughters. So there's a gender issue there as well. That's very common in Latin American offshore elites. I'm trying to write a little bit about that as well. And when Ecuador had the 2016 devastating earthquake, he avoided the one-time wealth tax by omitting the fact that he owned the second largest bank in the country. He claimed that because the bank actually belonged to a trust, he didn't have to pay taxes on that. So we're seeing there a very systematic behavior in terms of tax evasion. The campaigning conditions were unequal and were extreme. They had an unlimited budget, of course, being a banker. His social media budget went over the spending limits that were regulated by our electoral commission, and they were undeclared without our electoral commission. The mainstream media never covered this, and it was several $1 million over the limit. On the other hand, I was accused of receiving money from terrorists. The accusation was that I received a loan of $80,000. $80,000. Of course, that was absolutely fake, and the justice system suspended the investigations into this matter as it was obviously fake. However, it was levered against me by the major media and some of the pundits, and was probably a factor in the subsequent defeat. As you can see, The Guardian published this piece that revealed how the video where it accused me of being supported by the terrorists was obviously fake, and the way they fortunately were able to demonstrate it was by the squawking of a bird that didn't correspond to the Colombian geography, right? So this was very important in actually showing how broad the fake news were around the campaign, but also how the illicit financing were trying to get in the middle of the issue. Now, unfortunately, after the defeat, tax policy has already started to change. Just last week, transfer pricing tax evasion, so tax evasion related to transfer pricing, was decriminalized. It was decriminalized. And Ecuador is rejoining the ISDS system in order to give transnational corporations more legal power than humans. Human rights now are subordinated to investor-state arbitration. And this is a big deal in our country. We've been fighting against ISDS for a long time. Unfortunately, this is coming back. And like I mentioned, now tax evasion is partly decriminalized. But we won't stop. Tax justice campaigning must go on. And even plutocrats that are in charge of many countries will have to follow the global current in favor of tax justice. Politics are crucial. Of course, political parties' agendas are very important, but civil society campaigning is absolutely crucial as well. Research and advocacy must go on. And I, for me, will continue to publish at the Polarization Watch and other outlets. Please do count on me for this struggle. These continue to be exciting times, and it's a pleasure to share with you. I'm here willing to listen to you and to answer any of your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Arauz. That was a very brief whistle tour across human rights and tax justice. Thank you so much. I would like to come back with 2 questions, so you can have the freedom to respond to which of that you would like. Firstly, as a dedicated tax and gender working group member of the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, I would be very interested to hear what your thoughts are on the human rights system in relation to gender inequality, specifically in relation to what you mentioned about the maximum available resources in the CESCR, which obviously mention non-discrimination, but also non-retrogression and progressive achievement of human rights. So wondering if you have any thoughts on that specifically. And then secondly, you mentioned the very harmful rejoining of Ecuador to the ESDS settlement system, which puts non-state actors and corporates above human rights and above humans in our value. And there is a clear contrast, obviously, between ESDS mechanisms and trade and investment agreements with human rights. Do you have any thoughts on the role of a UN binding treaty on business and human rights that's also being being discussed and negotiated within the human rights system? Thank you so much.
Yes, definitely. So I'll start with the first question. Look, gender issues in tax policy are very important. One of my campaign proposals, as is the tendency in Latin America, was also to try to fix not only the tax policy issues related to gender on the expenditure side, which there's plenty to do in terms of how spending should be favorable more for equality, but also in terms of the revenue side. And one of the key proposals was to eliminate VAT for women's sanitary products and for products exclusively designed for women in general. This was unfortunately ridiculed in the Ecuadorian political scene, but fortunately, over a couple of months of discussion, this has now gained traction, because it is obvious that especially products related to menstruation have to be exempt. It is not something that should be taxable. There are now more proposals in that arena. As I've been obviously paying attention to the conference and to the gender equality issues for a long time, the caring economy and the caring society are very important. And part of my campaign proposals were specifically dedicated to the caring economy. We wanted to create a special distribution of resources. Some people like to call it the universal basic income, but we were designing something more specific for care, for the caring economy, for mothers especially, and also to bring back the caring system in Ecuador, which was unfortunately dismantled in the last government, and especially during the pandemic, with incorporation of over 20,000 early childhood educators to alleviate the situation for many of Ecuador's women, and of course to increase care and education of our youngest. And now, with regards to the UN binding agreement, this is very, very important. Unfortunately, the progress has been very slow, and the fact that Ecuador's administrations have been changing repeatedly have made the binding agreement, the drafts, subject to lobbying pressure from corporations and powerful states. I urge civil society all around the world to continue to exert pressure on the Ecuadorian government so that the binding agreement goes forward. Now the conditions are especially difficult given the new administration, but it is important to keep the progress ongoing. And now the binding agreement would be a very good alternative for this surge in ISDS, especially arbitrations related to the pandemic. Now, this is something unbelievable. Now there are corporations that are suing countries for taking measures during the pandemic, such as, suspension of toll roads or decrease in the volume of transport sector or the airfares and so on. And it really is a wild to see what kinds of things are happening right now.
Great, thank you so much for bringing those issues together. There are in the chat, which you cannot see at the minute, many shout outs to continue fighting the good fight, and many congratulations and thank yous to you. And also to everybody who is listening, a shout out to anybody interested in translating Mr. Arauz's paper from Spanish to English. Please let us know in the chat. Obviously, someone who understands the issues would be much appreciated, and would be great to have this resource available in English or in other languages as well. There are 2 more questions for you. They're both quite long, so I will read them quite slowly and then go back to you to respond to what you would like. From Naomi Fowler, how do you see the future of generational change? It feels so often like many nations in the world are transitioning painfully from the older generation of politicians who are stuck in their ways of thinking and embedded in finance, etc. How do we best mobilize, inspire, and connect together with younger people? That is one question. And then the second question is from Alex Copham. It would be fascinating to hear Mr. Arauz's thoughts on the coming trends across Latin America, thinking about Argentina taking a stand against inequality and the lack of ambition in the OECD reforms, about the polling predictions of a Lula victory in Brazil and potentially positive developments in Chile, Peru, and perhaps elsewhere. Is there a possibility, this is where the question begins, of a progressive regional actions and leadership in the UN processes for tax justice from the region? Over to you. Thank you so much.
Great. I'll start with Alex's question. Yeah, I definitely do see some bright lights in the Latin American region now. We're seeing that now the new Constituent Assembly in Chile. It's extremely exciting. It's extremely exciting. I hope we could have some people from Chile here or at the conference. But the Constituent Assembly is very progressive, and they are trying to be very forward-looking. I have a lot of hope because, coming from a constitution that was basically imposed on the people in a dictatorship for such a long time, now a constitution that is being written by the people and for the people, and they're doing it in the most people-based way possible. The president of the Constituent Assembly is a Mapuche linguist, and she has been an activist for decades. And the fact that she was chosen as the president of the assembly gives us a lot of hope of the direction that Chile is going. Now, I also see a lot of excitement in Peru. Many of our friends are involved with the new government in Peru, and definitely also coming up with a constituent assembly in Peru will be a great deal. They have already demonstrated that they will give tax justice issues key importance, both in the domestic as well as in the international arena. And I also see that with a bright light. Same for Colombia and Brazil. Next year we will have elections in both countries, and the perspectives are very positive. So Latin America and South America in particular will now be an area that will probably push for these issues around the globe, both in the UN and in other spaces like the G20 and so forth. I was also very happy to see Martín Guzmán, the Argentinian Minister of Finance, to push for the more aggressive minimum tax in the G20 discussions. Unfortunately, I see that the G7 OECD agreements of a 15% minimum tax for transnational corporations, with plenty of exceptions, are not enough. I mean, it's undeniable to think that this is a step forward. However, it is definitely not enough. We need to include a higher minimum percentage and a distribution of resources that's more aligned to reality and not heavily biased in favor of intangibles and in favor of transnational corporations of the North. I mean, something this big should have been to redistribute resources to the South rather than to reconcentrate them in the North. Similar thing that's happening in the SDRs, the special drawing rights that are being issued by the IMF by September. And they are again concentrated in the richest countries in the world. Only about a third of them will go to the poorest. So there are many issues to unravel in the international arena. Regarding Naomi's question in terms of generational change, this campaign was probably the most recent campaign where we had, TikTok as a protagonist, and, small videos, and just, completely based on the social networks, and, short videos, and ephemeral content is what we called it, where, basically you need a team of people, and crowdsourcing of campaign content to be designed in a way so that it fosters citizens' participation. And because of the new platforms that are available for political participation, that can actually happen nowadays. And what I proposed was what I called Democracy 3.0, which was trying to use all of the feedback mechanisms that we have from social networks, from wiki type planning of society and of development programs, and with a huge citizen participation, so that we can come up with collective plans in order to go forward. I think that this is a pretty interesting era, and especially at times of pandemic, my interaction was like this, basically more than half of the time.
Thank you so much. I would like to ask you one last question by Liz, which I think is a perfect summary between the issues that you've raised on human rights and tax justice. Liz asks, the private interests really shadow the United Nations, and yet as a tax justice movement, we often look to the UN for the global governance of tax and rule setting. What are your thoughts on the risks, or maybe the opportunities of this approach? You already mentioned the OECD and the IMF as a sort of even further counter there, but any thoughts on what we can do about this?
Yeah, it is absolutely crucial to take the debate to the United Nations, right? I really regret Addis Ababa in 2015, when we were so close to that, and a couple of rich countries and a bunch of lobbying interests avoided that. But that was a key moment for history, and I think it should take place as soon as possible. Hopefully, the Latin American region next year can take leadership in that and propose it again, and take that discussion onto the United Nations. I remember that one of my good friends, Pedro Paez, always said, it shouldn't be decided not at the G7, not at the G20, not at the G2, as the China-US relationship is sometimes called, but we need to take this to the G192. And this is where all countries have a say, and developing countries have more possibility to actually change how things are done. And we really need not only the discussion to take place at the UN, but we need an institution, a secretariat of some sorts, that can actually start to manage the issues with the interests of the subordinates of the world, of developing countries, but also of the peoples that have been excluded within those countries for historical reasons over and over again. So I think that we really need this debate to get out of the OECD and from unilateral measures like FATCA in the US, and bring them to the United Nations. The United Nations, of course, is not perfect, but it is much better, and we should push for that. We have to be very smart about it, and I think that there are many elements in which that we can leverage to take that discussion to the UN. Human rights is one of them, but also development has to be an issue as well, so that we can justify bringing that onto the UN. And of course, I salute the FACTI panel, which was a great initiative. Hopefully the panel recommends becoming something more permanent, and that recommendation can become an agreement from the G192.
Thank you so much, Mr. Arauz, for your very inspirational and positive contribution, and really inspiring us to keep fighting for tax justice, and rights, and we all look forward to having you with us in that fight. And as it's become very clear, is that we have no choice to stop at this point, and we have to continue collectively with this pursuit. So thank you very much, and all the best wishes to you. And thank you everyone for joining today. I think this is the end of the program, if I'm not correct, for today, but please, you can rejoin us tomorrow with the Tax Justice Conference, and we very much look forward to seeing you there again. Thank you so much, and have a lovely evening, morning.
Thank you, Roos. Thank you thank you, Tax Justice Network. Thank you everyone for attending, and thank you for organizing this conference. We need this multiplied times a million in order to actually have this be a mainstream issue around the world. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.